Hello, dear students. Today, our session will be about modernism literature, the American literature that starts in 1914 and ends in 1945. What were the most important causes of modernism? Starting with the World War I, urbanization and technology had the greatest effects on modernism, for that First World War shocked the world and its writers. Urbanization affected the locations and had people and writers constantly moving, and technology was a major theme of modernism and was used greatly throughout the literary movement's writing. It involved EAM artists and thinkers with the brutal actualities of large-scale modern war, so different from imagining heroism. A new term came to be used to describe the generation of men and women who came to maturity between First World War and the Depression of the 1930s. Stein expanded the meaning of the phrase "inconversion", with Ernest Hemingway saying that his was a decadent generation that was drinking itself to death. Urbanization: it is the constant movement immigrants from Europe. In 1910, 92 million people in the United States. In 1920, the population in the United States jumped to 10.57 million. Because of the urbanization, minorities such as African Americans had tried to make a new name for them in society. African Americans led the Harlem Renaissance. Then we move to industrialization, that is the processes of social and economic change that transformed the way people and the community lived. Here in this section, we can say that Romanticism philosophies of pantheism and transcendence no longer seem to cohere for those who had to cope with the technologies of industrial modernization. Going to immigration between 1880 and 1920, some 23 immigrants came to a country that numbered only 76 million in 19th. Immigrants made up 15% of the total population in 19th. In the first decade of the 20th century, immigrants constituted nearly 70% of industrial workforce. Then we came to the technological evolution. Here the aspects of telephones and electricity in homes changed. The gap between better and worse off Americans. Those without electricity and phones were literally out of the network. Phonography record and record player. Also, we have the automobile, which millions of jobs were created. Large-scale migrations from rural areas to urban centers, along with technological change. Scientists became aware that the short much of the common-sense basis of 19th century science had to be put aside in favor of far more powerful, but also far more complicated theories. The prevalent assumption was that non-scientific thinking could not explain anything, like what our scientists did. The atom was not the smallest unit of matter. It was a rule that followed by all people but without any explanation for it. Matter was not indestructible. Both time and space were relative to an observer's position. Some phenomena were so small that attempts to measurement would alter them. Some outcomes could be predicted only in terms of statistical probability. The universe might be infinite in size and yet infinitely expanding. Sigmund Freud, hidden in this unconscious were repressed experiences, traumas, forbidden desires, unacceptable emotions, most of these of a sexual nature, and many deriving from earliest childhood. The forbidden and impossible nature of these wishes left lifelong scars on the adult personality. Freud hypothesized that the process of analysis would help patients understand these emotions, and that the understanding in turn would enable them to productive adults. Karl Marx sought to explain history and produce a new sense of historical consciousness. The Industrial Revolution, according to him, depended on the accumulation of surplus capital by industrialists who paid the least possible amount to workers. The influences of Freud and Marx, the psychology of Freud and Karl have been seminal in the modern movement in literature. In many respects, it is a reaction against realism and naturalism and the scientific postulates on which they rest. All of these new ideas work to undermine long-held assumptions about language, culture, religion, and reality, which aided in the creation of the modernist self-prevalent among literary artists of this movement. The spirit of the modernist literature, it's a radical and utopian spirit stimulated by new ideas in anthropology, psychology, philosophy, and other fields. It's expressed rather mutedly by pastoral and often anti-modern poets. Modernist writing is marked by a strong and conscious break with tradition. It rejects traditional values and assumptions. Modern implies a historical disconnecting a sense of alienation, loss, and despair. It rejects not only history, but also the society of whose fabrication in history is error. Like poetry tended to provide pessimistic cultural criticism or loftily reject social issue altogether. Poetry becomes the place where one meaningful activity. Here are the characteristics of modernist writing: a movement away from realism and to abstractions, a deliberate complexity even to the point of ultimistic, forces readers